Alright then, so currently we have two files. We have index.js and also dom.js. Now we're exporting a few different things from this file and importing them over here. Now what I'm going to do is create a third file in the source folder called data.js, and this is going to be responsible for manipulating data and that kind of thing. The first thing I'm going to do is just paste in some data from my repo, just an array of different users, each one an object with a name and a premium flag. So imagine now I want to export this thing from this file. Now previously when we've been exporting things, we've been exporting multiple different things, and we did that by just putting an export keyword in front of the things we wanted to export, or just exporting them down here like this. Now we can also use what's known as a default export, and a default export can be seen as the main thing that we want to export from a file. And we can only have one default export per file. So in this case, I'd want the default export value of this data file to be the user's array right here, the data itself. So we'd make something a default export by saying this, export, then default, and then the thing we want to export as the default value. Now we want to export users. So now this will be the default value that we export from this file. Now let's try importing this. So I'm going to save it and go to index. And when we import a default value, we don't use curly braces like this. We just say import and then whatever we want to import, and this name can be whatever you want. So for example, I could call this test from then the name of the file. So that's // to say current directory data. So this is going to import this thing right here, users. Now I don't have to name it users because we're not putting this in curly braces to import specific things. We're importing the default value, and there's only one default value per file. So it's not going to look for something called test. It knows when we use something outside of curly braces that this is the default export we want. So it knows to get this thing right here. But for continuity, I tend to call them the same thing anyway. So I'm going to import users from data. So now if I wanted to use this, I could do, I'm just going to say console.log, and we're going to log out the users. So let me save this. We need to run npm run webpack for this to compile. And when it's done, let's go over here. And now we can see this thing over here, all of the users. So we have now exported a default value and we've imported that right here. Now, just because we export a default value in this file, it doesn't mean that we can't export anything else as well. So let's try creating a function now inside this file that we also want to export. So I'm going to say down here, const get prem users, and this function is going to be responsible for getting the actual premium users from a users array. So we're going to take in a parameter, which will pass in when we call this function later, and inside we're going to return a value, and that value is going to be users.filter, so it will be a filtered array, and we only want to keep a user in that array if the user.premium is true. So if user.premium is true as we cycle through the users array, then it's going to keep that inside the filtered array, and we're returning this filtered array at the end. So now I want to export this as well, so I could come up here and say export const premium users, and now we can import this thing right here. So let me copy that and come over here to index. And now because we're importing a named export, and I say named export because that's what these things are when we're exporting specific names and not just the default. So we can import that the same way as these named imports. So let's do a comma first of all, because we're done with the default export. Now we want to also import a named export. So we want to import this thing right here, get prem users. And now from this file, we can use that. So I'm going to say in this file now, const, and then I'll just call this prem users is equal to get prem users, which is the function we just imported. We need to pass an argument through here, remember, because we take an argument in here. So we'll just take in the users, which we imported as well, and we'll pass that in. So users, and now down here, I'm going to log out prem users as well as users. So let me see if this all works. I'm going to save it, come down here, run npm run webpack. Then I'm going to come to the browser and see if this works. So we can see now the users here, and also the premium users. So this is the value returned by that function. So this is working. We're importing the default export now, users, and also this named export, the function, which we're calling right here. So remember, to export a default value, we say export default users. And to export other values, we can say export const and then whatever the value is. Now let's have a look at the alternative way of exporting things where we define it all at the bottom. So I'm going to delete that, and I'm also going to delete this. Now the way we do this is by saying export and then the object. We want to export get prem users, which is this function right here. So now we're doing that one, but we also want to export this, but we want to export it as the default value. And the way we do that down here is by saying users as default. So now it exports this as the default object. And again, we don't need to change now the way we're importing these things over here. This is just an alternative way of exporting. So let me save this now. Let me run this again. npm run webpack and preview, and we can see everything still works the same way. So my friends, that's how we use default export. It's a default value from a file that we want to export, and we can only have one default export value per file.